Imagine you work at the most complicated office in all of France. Every single morning you walk in and there it is, a pile of letters on your desk. They are unsigned with no return address, just grievances from people who wanted to say something but didn't want to be known for saying it. Some days the pile is 20 letters high, and some days it's 50 letters high, and it's your job to read every single one. In 19th century France, the anonymous letter was practically a national pastime. They had a word for it, la délation, the act of informing on or denouncing someone in writing, usually in secret, and the Paris Prefecture of Police received them by thousands. Historians who have gone through those archives describe them as overwhelmingly, almost comically petty. My neighbor's cooking smells are fouling the air. The woman down the street is receiving too many male visitors. A man is making noise at an indecent hour. I suspect my landlord is voting wrong. I really, deeply hate the people next door. Need the police to know about it? These letters poured in from every corner of every village, every bourgeois household with a grudge and an inkwell. So the police stopped reading them. Not officially or as a policy per se, but in practice. When you are wading through 50 letters a week accusing neighbors of immorality, bad smells, suspicious visitors, and noise after 9 o'clock, you develop a reflex. You learn to skim. You learn to dismiss. And you file them away or you throw them away, and you move on to things that actually matter. La délation had poisoned its own well, because when everything is urgent, nothing is. But some of those letters, buried somewhere in the pile, underneath the noise complaints and the petty neighborhood vendettas, were real. Someone writing in genuine desperation, or someone who had witnessed something sinister. Someone who knew something was wrong behind a closed door and had no other way to say it except anonymously, on paper, slipped into a postbox and hoped to God someone on the other end would actually read it. Most of those letters were never acted on, and we will never know how many people suffered for it, or after the fact, how many situations festered, worsened, or quietly collapsed. Because whoever held the letter decided it wasn't worth their time. What we do know is this. In 1901, a letter arrived at the Paris Prefecture of Police, unsigned with no return address. Just a few lines about a house in Poitiers and a well-respected family. Whoever opened it almost certainly had a pile of 50 others waiting. But someone did read it. And then someone made a phone call. And nothing in that house was ever the same again. This is part 4 of the Blanche Monnier story. The woman who wasn't saved by her friends or family, but by an anonymous letter. A letter whose author, to this day, remains unknown. By the end of the 19th century, France was in the middle of a full-blown domestic crisis. Living standards had risen, which sounds like a good thing, and it was, but it meant that a huge chunk of the working class had quietly crossed over into the middle class. And middle-class families? They do not serve other families. Quitting domestic service was basically the fastest way to complete your transformation. One day you're scrubbing someone else's floors, and the next you're a respectable household. Servants were leaving, and the families who relied on them were panicking. And Louise was no different, because with Marie gone, she now had to find someone to replace a woman who had devoted 45 years of her life to that house, and to the care of Blanche. And she couldn't. Not even close. The domestic crisis meant that even unqualified maids were hard to come by, and the ones Louise did manage to hire didn't exactly stick around. Some lasted less than 2 days before walking out, calling the situation intolerable. And when you think about what these maids were walking into, an increasingly filthy house, Blanche, that room, and Louise herself, intolerable feels like an understatement. Louise, for her part, would fire maids on the spot for complaining. So she couldn't keep them around, and she couldn't stop driving them away either. The woman had finally run out of people willing to endure her. Around the same time in 1897, the family doctor was replaced by a Dr. Sheeran. I couldn't find out why, but since the original doctor shows up later at the trial, he clearly hadn't died, and so presumably he had retired or moved away somewhere. Not that it made any difference to Blanche, because Dr. Sheeran could testify on day 2 of the future trial and say that he had not once ever heard of Blanche Monnier. He had no idea she existed. We can't ever get into the mind of Louise, but comment now to tell me why you think the new family doctor never even knew Blanche existed. And I'm not talking about not examining Blanche like the doctors before her, but never even knew she was alive. But by October 1898, Louise was down to 1 cook and 1 maid. Celine, the cook, was by all accounts a thoughtful and compassionate woman, which, in that house, made her public enemy number 1 as far as Louise was concerned. Celine noticed that Blanche lit up around flowers. But even though Blanche could hardly speak anymore, flowers seemed to reach her in a way little else could. Celine started bringing small bouquets into her room. One morning, Blanche managed to ask for flowers from the garden, and Louise shut it down immediately. "It will upset her, so I won't allow it." Celine brought them in anyway, and Blanche was very happy. Celine also noticed the mattress. By this point, the mattress was so rotten, it was barely a mattress at all. So she asked Louise if she could replace it with one of the several unused mattresses in the home. And Louise told her, "Others have tried and have not been successful, so don't bother." Whatever that means. So Celine went ahead and pulled a mattress from one of the guest rooms anyway, rooms that hadn't seen a guest in probably literal decades, and swapped them out. Louise found out and made her swap them back. Celine also gave Blanche one of her own personal sheets because the one Blanche had was in the same condition as the mattress. She tried to give her a pillow, because Blanche didn't have one, and Louise forbade it. So Celine stuffed some small cushions with straw instead to use that as a pillow for Blanche. Celine lasted 6 months in that house, but in 6 months, she had done more for Blanche than the people responsible for her had done in years. I hope on some level, Blanche knew she had been seen by Celine. By that following year, in 1899, Louise was desperate enough to hire a maid named Juliette and a cook named Eugenie. Neither of them had references, that's how desperate Louise was, and it wouldn't take long to show. At the trial, the maids testified about when they first arrived at the Monnier home. Louise sat them down and told them about Blanche. She was unpredictable, Louise said, spoiled, and the girls admitted that was enough for them. That explanation alone was admittedly enough for them to not particularly concern themselves with Blanche's care. Louise had successfully done what she'd always done, control the narrative before anyone could form their own. And it gets a bit complicated because those same girls also testified that Louise went out of her way, genuinely out of her way, to make sure Blanche was fed well. 2 to 3 times a week, specialty meals were prepared and delivered to the house, all for Blanche and no one else. And when oyster season came around, fresh oysters were delivered every single day for the entire season, because they were Blanche's favorite. Louise was apparently a nightmare of a customer, demanding the freshest ingredients and the best cuts of meat. Dishes from the finest restaurants in the city, expensive and carefully chosen, were her demands. And if you just will sit with me for a second, because I'm still not sure what to do with this information. The oysters almost certainly went uneaten. We know what potassium bromide does to appetite over years of use. It devastates it. Blanche by this point was barely eating. So what was Louise doing? Performing love? Convincing herself? Or was there some part of her that genuinely believed expensive oysters and fine restaurant meals could coexist with everything else happening in that room? I don't have an answer. But I think that tension is important because Louise was never simply a monster who felt nothing. She was something harder to make sense of than that. So with Blanche locked in the attic and Louise barely leaving her room for days at a time, along with Louise practically handing them a reason not to look too closely on day one, they took it. They figured out pretty quickly that nobody was watching, so they stopped doing much of anything. In a letter to Marcel while he was away on holiday, Louise called them the worst maids yet. She said they were out late, going to parties, and then used some choice words I don't really need to repeat here. She begged Marcel to have Angel find her someone, anyone more reputable. And honestly, for once, I don't think Louise was exaggerating. Every single night, these girls planted themselves in front of the Monnier home and flirted with passerby soldiers for hours. And we're not talking about sneaking around. This was a nightly ritual right at the entrance of the house. Sometimes they'd convince one of the soldiers to take them to the cabaret, just leaving, no permission asked. And so we're clear, live-in servants weren't entitled to free time whenever they felt like it. Any time off had to be cleared with the employer. But beyond the rule breaking, Louise's bigger problem was the spectacle of it. Soldiers at the front door every night, the girls hanging out, neighbors watching. This was exactly the kind of visible, gossipy scandal that Louise had spent decades keeping the Monnier name away from. She wanted them gone. But her health was declining rapidly. She had no replacements, and an empty house was worse than a circus one. So she kept them and complained about it in her letters to Marcel instead. Now, and I want to be clear about this, what I just described is not what makes Juliette and Eugenie the villains of this chapter. Sneaking out to flirt with soldiers? Fine. Young and irresponsible? Sure. But when they neglected their duties, Blanche is the one who paid for it. She could not care for herself. She could not clean up after herself. She could not advocate for herself. So when the plates from the previous day's meals were left sitting in that room, and then the day after that, and then the day after that, rotting food accumulated in an already unlivable space until there were cockroaches and maggots. And then there was what the maids called putting Mademoiselle Blanche to bed. At trial, they described it themselves. Blanche would get on all fours. The maid would lift the sheet under her, the sheet that had collected her excrement from the past 24 hours. 24 hours. During this entire process, Blanche stayed on all fours naked. And according to the girls, Marcel had witnessed this on more than one occasion, just as an aside. But this next part is where I really struggled to get past. They told people. Not in the way someone tells people because they're horrified and just don't know what to do. They brought strangers into that house and up to that attic and showed Blanche off like she was an exhibit and something to be gawked at. That woman who had once been described as one of the most beautiful girls in Poitiers was being paraded in front of strangers for entertainment. In December 1900, one of these strangers named Félicie Fritz knocked on the door of the Monnier home. She was a hat maker and made her living selling hats door to door. The two girls answered, and instead of taking her to a sitting room and offering her tea, they told her they should come see Blanche. Out of what I'm sure was probably morbid curiosity, Félicie followed them up to the attic. The room was so dark she could barely make out a shape of Blanche on the bed. But she could see that the table was covered in rotting food. And then Blanche said to the two young maids, "You know I don't want you bringing any more visitors." Félicie left immediately. She was not the first. Over roughly 5 months, at least 10 people were brought up to that room and left having seen something they could never explain away. These visitors all described the same things. The smell that hit you before you even reached the door. The darkness, the rotting food. Blanche's emaciated naked body. Some of them said she frightened them, that she looked, in their words, crazy. And not one of those spectators called the police or a doctor. They just watched. By spring 1901, Louise is showing major signs of heart disease and her health collapses. Whatever thin thread of household management she had still been holding on to was gone, which meant things got worse, if you can even imagine that. By this point, the two young maids, Juliet and Eugenie, had seen enough. The same two girls who had been bringing strangers up to Blanche's room for 5 months now said that they were too scared to continue caring for her and wanted to call the police. And of course, that's a bit of a whiplash-inducing turn. I think bringing strangers to see Blanche was, in some twisted way, a kind of excitement. Something to do, something to talk about, and something that made that suffocating house feel a little less boring. But I think the novelty wore off, and the spectacle became just a woman deteriorating in front of them every single day in cockroaches and maggots. At some point, it stops being something you can detach from. Then, when Louise got seriously ill, it meant the psychological buffer was gone. When Louise was managing the house, even badly so, there was still an authority figure absorbing some of the mental weight and load of what was happening there. With Louise bedridden, Juliet and Eugenie were suddenly alone in that house with Blanche, in a way they had never been quite before. No one to defer to, no one to tell themselves who was ultimately responsible for her care. So first, the maids went to Modeste for help, Marie Faye's sister, if you recall. Modeste, too, had worked in that house years before, so she knew the house and the family and exactly what was happening inside those walls. And sadly, Modeste did not say, "Yes, call the police." She said, "How would it benefit you? You're very well off here. There are others who have felt as you do and said nothing. You just have to be like them." Juliet pushed back. So Modeste shifted and said, "Then you must do what you want. You know what state Blanche is being kept in, and you are adult enough to know what your duty is." Which is a remarkable thing to say when Modeste herself saw what state Blanche was in and said nothing and did nothing herself. So Juliet then went to Marcel's wife, Angele, instead and told her there were cockroaches on Blanche's bed. Angele didn't bother to go check and said she'd tell Marcel. After she told Marcel, his response was, "I find that hard to believe, but I will tell my mother." So the two maids had contacted Modeste, Angele, and now Marcel, who were the only people left in that Monnier orbit, and gotten nothing. No action or urgency, just the same wall the house had always put up. And that's when, I think, Juliet and Eugenie's conscience apparently caught up with them. Why it caught up with them now and not during the months they were parading strangers through Blanche's room, I genuinely cannot tell you. Maybe at some point the freak show just becomes a woman, and you can't unsee that. But one of those strangers who'd witnessed Blanche's state was Juliet's boyfriend, a French lieutenant named Jean-Luc. And unlike everyone else who had walked through that door and said nothing, he had left angry and visibly shaken, full of pity for the woman he'd seen up in the dark attic. Sometimes it takes someone from the outside, someone with no stake in keeping the secret, to reflect back to you what you have been normalizing. So just to clarify our timeline here, it was about March 1901 when Louise became very ill and the two maids had a stroke of consciousness and reached out to the family for help. A couple of months after this, on the morning of May 22nd, 1901, the Attorney General of Paris, Léon Bulot, received an anonymous letter dated May 19th. Now, when the Attorney General received this letter, he didn't immediately sit up straight and call for his coat. Anonymous letters were not unusual. In fact, they were a fairly routine part of how French authorities received information from the public, and had been for generations. People wrote in anonymously about their neighbors all the time. A dispute over a property line, a business suspect of fraud, or a wife who thought her husband was hiding money. Maybe an establishment thought to be operating without the proper licenses. Complaints about noise, indecency, or about someone's son causing trouble in the street. All common. And they were anonymous for obvious reasons. It was a country of tight social circles where everyone knew everyone and a signed complaint could follow you for the rest of your life. So you didn't sign your name on it, you sent it anonymously and kept your head down and hoped someone acted on it. Most of these letters were small, petty even, the kinds of grievances people couldn't resolve face to face, but didn't want to attach their name. It might cause an awkward scandal. and the vast majority of these letters, when investigated, turned out to be exactly what they sounded like. A neighbor with a grudge, a business rival, someone settling a score, or something similar to that. The letter dated May 19th, 1901 was none of that. Like everyone else in Poitiers, Bülow knew the Monniers and found them to be a respectable family. He was gobsmacked at the accusation outlined in the letter and couldn't believe that they were true. But because the letter mentioned several alleged crimes, it was his duty to look into it. By the afternoon on the 22nd, Bülow had pieced together enough of the Monnier family to begin his report, and what he found was a neighborhood full of stories, none of which agreed with each other. She had gone to boarding school in England or Scotland and simply never came back. Blanche had died from tuberculosis while abroad. And it starts to get darker here. She had fallen pregnant out of wedlock and died in childbirth or from an abortion. Or that she hadn't died but had the child and was living quietly somewhere in the countryside. Or she had eloped with an older Belgian man and was living with him. Or she had lost the baby, never left, and was simply somewhere. She had gone mad after the deaths of her grandmother and father and had been moved to the attic for her own safety. And it was there that her lewd and erratic behaviors had emerged. And I'm not entirely sure where these stories or statements came from or how they spread, because Louise and Marcel weren't completely silent about Blanche. They told doctors, maids, people in their circle that she was unwell. So did people hear she's not well and invent the rest themselves? Was the full truth only ever shared with a handful of people while everyone outside that circle was left to fill in the gaps? Or are some of these just things neighbors thought they vaguely remembered once the story exploded and suddenly everyone had a version of it? I really can't say with certainty. But 25 years is a long time for a rumor to take on a life of its own. 25 years, and the best anyone in Poitiers could offer was a scattered collection of half-remembered gossip and stories that contradicted each other at every turn. Nobody knew, or rather, nobody had looked hard enough to find out. Clearly, something wasn't adding up, and Bülow needed to launch a full-fledged investigation. By the next morning at 8:30 a.m. on Thursday, May 23, 1901, Bülow contacts Commissioner Boucheton with a series of orders and instructions to start the investigation immediately. At 2:30 that afternoon, a police sergeant and Commissioner Boucheton rang the doorbell of the Monnier house. Juliet answered, and when Boucheton asked to speak with Louise, she told them Louise was bedridden and couldn't receive visitors. They pushed back, as you'd expect, and Juliet disappeared inside, only to return with the message that Louise suggested that they try Marcel across the street. So they walked across the street and rang the doorbell. A maid answered and delivered almost the exact same line. Monsieur Marcel was far too ill to receive anyone. Boucheton looked at the two houses, one on each side of the street, and both suddenly and conveniently inhabited by people too unwell to come to the door on the same afternoon, and said, "It's a very strange coincidence that everyone seems unwell in these two houses," which apparently was enough to flush Marcel out. He appeared, but he came out swinging in the way that men who know they've been caught tend to do. Defensive, agitated, and he kept repeating, "Who are you? Who are you?" as if demanding credentials might somehow change what was happening on his doorstep. And Boucheton, without missing a beat, said, "You are fully aware of who I am because your maid just announced me." And then he told Marcel about the letter. Marcel called the letter slander, terrible slander, and he was deeply offended. So offended that the police would even waste their time showing up at his door. But then, in the same breath, he shrugged and said his mother runs her own household and he has nothing to do with her affairs. So which is it, Marcel? If you don't know what goes on in your mother's home, how do you know they're lies? But the police just let Marcel's contradictions go. The commissioner asked for his name and age, a routine question. The kind you answer in 3 seconds, but Marcel answered it in 30 seconds. His name, his age, and then, unprompted, a reminder that he was a doctor of law and a former sub-prefect. He was a man of standing and thus should not be questioned in his own doorway. Boucheton didn't care. He said, "The best way to prove your innocence is to let me see your sister." But Marcel refused. Conveniently, he said the doctor orders no one to visit Blanche because of her fever, and visitors aren't part of her treatment plan. Finally, Marcel arrogantly states that Blanche has neither been neglected or imprisoned, and that he himself goes to see her several times a day. Wait, I thought you weren't involved, Marcel, and know nothing of these matters. The tense conversation continued on with something like this.
On our walk over, I noticed the highest window has a padlock and chains.
I will report your accusations to the public prosecutor.
All you need to do to clear this matter up is take me to your sister.
I don't see how that will do anything to negate such vile accusations, but I will take you to my sister if I can get my mother's approval first.
Surprisingly, they are allowed to go upstairs to Blanche's room, but the attic door is closed. Marcel turns the knob, and it's locked. He looks at the officer and commissioner and shrugs like, what do you do? And again, Boucheton is not buying this and says, you have a key to this door, so please open it. Unless, of course, you would prefer us to break it down. And lo and behold, Marcel pulls out a key from his jacket pocket. The first thing they noticed after the door is unlocked and pushed open is the overpowering stench. So much so that before they even enter the pitch black room, the commissioner has to lean over the stair banister and throw up everywhere. All while Marcel seems unbothered by the smell. After composing himself, the commissioner first walks to the window to confirm it was indeed padlocked and chained shut, plus he realizes that the frame is caulked to seal it shut, making it impossible for any airflow. Marcel said, "This arrangement with the curtains and the shutters is a precautionary measure to prevent my sister from throwing herself out the window." I'm just going to throw this out there, but were they concerned that Blanche was going to throw herself out of the cracks of the window frame? That's why they had to caulk it? Once his eyes adjusted, the commissioner began to take in everything you already know about this room. The rotting mattress, rodent droppings, human feces, both fresh and old, rotting food, oyster shells, infestations of bugs. He immediately knocked a hole in one of the shutters, and a blast of light came pouring into a room that hasn't seen it for decades. And that's when the screaming begins. The commissioner sees the sound is coming from a naked woman laying on the straw mattress. He hadn't noticed her there before, in the dark, but now he can understand why. She is a shrieking skeleton, describing her arms being no thicker than the neck of a bottle, and her fingers like pencils. He sees the maggots crawling in her long, matted black hair. She has a filthy scrap of fabric pressed to her face, and she is so thin and hollowed out that the piercing sound seems too large for her small body to produce. Finally, the commissioner processes what he sees and erupts. It is unhuman to leave a poor creature in such a pitiful state. There will certainly be significant legal consequences to this discovery, Monsieur Marcel, he says. Marcel immediately goes full baby boy and says, I am the victim of my filial piety. Whatever may have happened here is because I never wanted to go against the express wishes of my mother, who wanted, as I've already said, to be the mistress of her own home. One police officer named Fourier asked the maids Eugenie and Juliette, "What do you think you're doing leaving this unfortunate woman in such a state? And why didn't you say anything about it?" Juliette responded defensively and said, "What do you expect? We have been here for 2 years. We are 20 years old. When we arrived here, we were 18 years old. And Madame Bourland, who was in charge of us maids in the house and who directed everything, told us, above all, do not worry about what is happening here and do not say anything to anyone else, as it has nothing to do with you. And if you ever repeat anything to anyone, then remember, Monsieur Monnier, a member of the Poitiers High Society, has a very long arm and could hurt you and prevent you from earning a living." And ignoring all these excuses, the commissioner and officer ran out of that house and straight to the prosecutor. Later, by 5 p.m., the prosecutor, deputy, investigating judge, forensic doctor, and Marcel were all in Blanche's room. Some of them vomited, as you might expect, and Marcel began vomiting his same old story. The pernicious fever, his filial piety, and how he's the true victim in all of this. The prosecutor shuts him up by saying, "You are a criminal. Your place is not here, but in front of a sentencing judge." The prosecutor then ordered the shutters pried open, but they inevitably had to remove them by the hinges. He could now see the full room, including the walls with inscriptions scrawled all over them. They were difficult to decipher at first because the words were also smeared with feces and dust from all the years. The following day, the photographer Victor Merkin took several photographic evidence of several of these inscriptions, such as, "It is terrible to be forced to live and die in a dungeon. Some children are much more preferred than others. Will I ever see freedom? Liberté. Alas, it's over for me." Blanche had been screaming in fear this entire time, saying, "Please leave me alone. Just let me live in my dear little cave." They lifted Blanche off the rotting mattress, and vermin, feces, and rotting food were literally falling off of her. They wrapped her in a blanket they found from the adjoining room and carried her to the ambulance waiting outside. By 7 p.m., Blanche is at the Hôtel Dieu, a hospital near Notre Dame in Paris. After her initial assessment by the chief physician named Larange, he reported that Blanche's skin was white as wax, and she was dreadfully emaciated. Her muscles were so atrophied that she could not stand up or walk. The doctor stated, "If Mademoiselle Blanche Monnier was intelligent in the past, as the information collected tends to indicate, she could have been afflicted between the ages of about 15 to 20 years old by a mental illness called hebephrenia, or early dementia, and from that time on have remained in a state roughly identical to that in which she is now. I cannot affirm any of that, as that type of dementia does not make all of the faculties disappear." And I take this to mean that many things he observed about Blanche show she was suffering from dementia, but that not even dementia would cause this much loss of functioning. One doctor said, "No description can give a sufficient account of the state in which she now finds herself. She is an absolute wreck of a human being, the most appalling example of a mere shell of a person." And another doctor said, "It is my opinion that Blanche Monnier is not a mad woman. She certainly gives the appearance of being an adult that has regressed to childhood." The hospital staff weren't prepared for what they had to examine. Blanche's body was skeletal, covered head to toe in a thick layer of grime. The hair on her left side was long and matted, so compacted with feces and food debris that combing through it was never an option. They shaved it off. On her right side, she barely had any hair at all. And that actually made sense once they understood how she'd been living. Blanche had spent so long lying curled up on her right side, and the friction had worn the hair away. The smell from her hair alone was enough to cloud the entire room. The doctors even let people smoke just to cut through the dreadful smell. They carefully cut and preserved her hair as evidence. It measured 1 meter long and weighed 2.5 kilograms. That's about 5.5 pounds. So just imagine that. Blanche herself weighed 23 kilograms, which is about 51 pounds. She was so weak that the hospital called in the chaplain to administer last rites. They genuinely didn't know if Blanche was going to survive. Last rites are essentially a final prayer performed for someone about to die. It's the Catholic way of preparing a soul for death. The belief is that if you die without the last rite, your soul isn't absolved of its sins before passing. No last rites meant dying with unfinished spiritual business. And in Catholic belief, dying without last rites meant your soul could be denied entry into heaven or be stuck in purgatory, a kind of spiritual waiting room where your soul lingers, unable to fully pass on. But Blanche had survived this long, and she would end up outliving her brother and mother. So the nurses washed Blanche, trimmed her nails, put her in a clean nightgown and cap, and laid her in a bed with fresh sheets. She resisted through all of it, but the nurses got it done. And as she drifted off to sleep, she murmured quietly to herself, "My dear little cave." After Blanche is whisked away to the hospital and the attic is being disinfected and evidence collected, Marcel is busy gathering a support team. This is what's on his mind as his sister's been found half dead in his mother's attic. He goes to Modeste first thing the following morning on Friday, May 24th, and the conversation went a little something like this.
A terrible thing has happened. It's my sister. She's been taken to the Hotel Dieu.
That can only be a good thing. It's not a terrible thing at all.
If you're asked, could you say that you know that I did everything I could for my sister and that I cared for her very well?
But I don't know anything about how you, or anyone else, cared for your sister.
Marcel reportedly left Modeste's house in a panic. By the afternoon, he's lassoed a group of lawyer friends in his living room to apparently ask for legal advice. And I feel like this is probably a good time to mention that whether or not you believe Marcel is guilty of being an accomplice here or not, this is absolutely cold and selfish. He is only worried about himself and no one else here, and that's telling. By 6:45 that evening, in front of all his attorney buddies, Marcel is arrested right there in his living room. By this point, word had spread and media and a curious crowd was growing outside both the Monnier homes. The crowds shouted insults and accusations at Marcel and Louise, while simultaneously giving reports and statements to the media. They were witness to Blanche's screaming and rumors of her unfathomable living situation. One maid who had worked in the house for over a year didn't mince words. The Monniers and de Marnaquets, she said, were a respectable family, except for one. She called Louise an old criminal, the cause of everything terrible that happened in that house, a woman who made life miserable for everyone who crossed her path. And then she described that the moment Louise walked into Blanche's room, Blanche would throw whatever clothes she had on off toward Louise. Then she'd throw anything else she could get her hands on, shouting the same thing over and over. "Do you remember? Do you remember?" Blanche wouldn't stop. She wouldn't calm down, not until Louise left the room. The maids each had their own piece of it. Maid Manon said, Blanche saw people who wanted to kill her. She would scream at them, whoever the murderer was in her mind, and she would not stop until they were gone. Cook God said Blanche would come into the kitchen completely naked, hiding her face behind a scarf, telling her that ghosts were following her. Maid Claire said Blanche screamed at night. And then there was the locksmith. He had been called to the Monnier home more than once, to Blanche's room specifically to fix the padlock and caulk the gaps shut. Louise's explanation was always the same. She didn't want a draft. It was too cold. On one of those visits, he saw Blanche. She was squatting naked in the middle of the floor, her hair loose and hanging over her shoulders. He told her she shouldn't be sitting that way. Blanche laughed and stayed exactly where she was the entire time he worked. The irony of what these people heard and saw but did not report, it seems, was lost on them. By 8 p.m. that night, Louise was also arrested while reportedly saying, "Is it possible for such a fuss to be created over nothing? Because no fuss must be made over Blanche. In fact, we must pretend that she doesn't exist at all, don't we, Louise?" Now, remember, Louise is very ill at this point, but the police must not have been too worried because rather than an officer, they had one of her maids escort her down the street to the prison. The prison itself has a history worth mentioning. The building started its life as a convent in the early 1600s, home to the Visitation order, a congregation of sisters who visited and cared for the sick and the poor. Then the French Revolution hit in 1789. The sisters were expelled from their convent, and the building was repurposed the way the Revolution repurposed a lot of things, harshly. It became a tribunal, then a prison, and it functioned as both courthouse and jail all the way up until 2010, before it was renovated into the restaurants and shops it is today. The anger of the crowds outside the prison had increased, and it didn't take them long to call for Marcel and Louise's execution. Marcel's lawyer friends told the crowd that the arrests were arbitrary. The people didn't take too kindly to this, and their hostility turned on Marcel's friends. Crowds did not die down until about 10 p.m. that night, and in chalk, they wrote on both the Monnier house doors, "Death, execution, murderers." People threatened to destroy the house and the servants' houses, believing that the servants were equally complicit. Marcel's daughter, Lola, was an attractive young lady of 26 years old and was engaged to a respectable French officer. Unsurprisingly, in the ensuing scandal, the officer hastily broke off the engagement. Then, despite their insistence that they had no idea what was happening, Angel and her daughter Lola had to retreat to a convent for their own protection. Both Louise and Marcel were held on pre-trial detention, meaning they were not able to leave the prison before trial, and at their own expense had to have meals prepared and brought to them at the prison door. Louise wanted her maids to make her meals, but they refused, saying that they simply don't pay her enough. So she just decided to order her meals from the Hôtel de France. Louise also found out that she could earn 10 cents a day by shelling and bagging peanuts with the other inmates, so she did that to offset the money she spent on meals. Today, that would be about 60 to 80 cents a day. Prison labor wasn't designed to reward inmates, it was designed to keep them occupied. But leave it to Louise to miss the point entirely. Here she is, seriously ill, and instead of resting, she's shelling peanuts for 10 centimes a day. Not to pass the time, not for the routine, because she wanted the money. In the meantime, Marcel is trying to stay on the good side of his fellow prisoners by helping them write letters to their families for those who could not write. Altruistic or not wanting to get beat up, you tell me. By Saturday, May 25th, the police finished their seizure of evidence from the attic of everything disgusting you already know about, plus the shutters, padlock, door frame, notebooks, books, bugs, pencils, 2 statues of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a doll head, rosary, 10-cent coin, and pieces of the faded wallpaper with the inscriptions. Then the room was sealed shut. This story spread internationally and consumed the media. While today that doesn't really seem out of the ordinary because everything is basically breaking news, in 1901 it was wildly uncommon. Naturally, the story horrified people. The coverage sparked heated public debates about family honor versus individual rights. But once the sensationalism of the story settled, people began to wonder the why of it all. They wanted to know how Louise could be such an unnatural mother, and why hadn't her highly esteemed brother rescued her? Why hadn't the neighbors, who were now making reports of what they'd witnessed and heard, said or done anything? They began to conclude that Louise must have had criminal intention behind it. I don't think they could process the idea of a cruel mother for evil's sakes. And just as we do today, when something dark and breaking hits the headlines, we research armchair detective style. The community learned about Louise's distant connection with the aristocratic lineage and expressed how the Monniers were the perfect example of a degenerate nobility that the Republic had been created to get rid of. This really wasn't just a throwaway insult because France had spent the better part of a century trying to claw its way out from under exactly that kind of nobility. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI had become the symbol of everything wrong with the aristocracy, out of touch, self-serving, and utterly indifferent to the suffering happening right outside their doors. The revolution had literally taken their heads for it. And here, over 100 years later, the public was looking at Louise Monnier and seeing the same thing. A woman so obsessed with appearances, with status, and with what the neighbors thought that she had locked her own daughter in a room and left her to rot. Same disease, different century. 10 days later, on Thursday, June 6th at 6:57 p.m., Marcel is interrogated by the police. He regurgitates the same story about Blanche's illness since 1872. The following is not the complete transcript, word for word. Some of the statements are quotes, and some of them are statements based on what the investigator and Marcel said. And I did this because there were a lot of pauses and disconnected comments, so this is sort of the band-aided version. Investigator: what were your mother's feelings regarding her daughter? Marcel: my mother always had far more affection for Blanche than for me. Investigator: why didn't you give Blanche basic care after your mother became ill and the responsibility fell to you? Marcel: I did not feel it was my right in my mother's home to give my mother's servants any orders, but I did make 1 or 2 simple recommendations. Investigator: how was it that you weren't bothered by the terrible smell of the room? Marcel: I never noticed anything abnormal. I was amazed when I was told about the repulsivity, filthy state of the room. Then Marcel contradicts himself and adds, the room's state of uncleanliness that you observed does not date back very far, only to when our regular maid died. And of course he's talking about Marie Fazy here. Investigator: why were the shutters chained, padlocked, and sealed shut? Marcel: that was my father's doing. Investigator: were you never concerned for your sister's well-being? Marcel: of course, but I was not the master of the household. My sister lived in my mother's house. On many occasions, I tried to insist that my mother send Blanche to a nursing home, but my mother refused to listen to me and often got angry with me if I became too insistent. She threatened to disown and disinherit me if I persisted in mentioning putting Blanche in a care home. Aware of my mother's age and concerned by her weak heart, I finally stopped mentioning the subject to her. I was helpless. I deeply regret it. Investigator: don't you think you should have insisted upon it more strongly? Marcel: my filial piety has led me to become a respectful son who was, is, and always has been purely and simply deferential to all paternal and maternal authority. With regards to my sister's weight loss, which I was totally unaware of until it was explained to me, it is now quite obvious that not all of the food sent up to her by her mother reached its destination. Later that night at 9:02 p.m., Louise is also interrogated. But this time they have to do it in the infirmary because she is so ill. Nevertheless, she answers the questions precisely. Investigator: what can you tell me about the way you treated your daughter? Louise: my daughter, I adored her. I sacrificed myself for her by keeping her at home. If I had known all the trouble that my love for my child was going to cause me, and that all of this would be the reward for my care, I would have acted like a stepmother. That is, I would have sent my daughter, my poor daughter, to a nursing home where she would have died long ago. Investigator: why did you imprison your daughter for 25 years? Louise: I never confined my daughter, who I love very much, nor have I ever considered confirming her. She has always been free to move around the house. I must say that for the past 25 years, she has voluntarily stayed in her room. In fact, I believe it was in about 1876 that she decided she would stay in bed rather than get up. She insisted on staying in bed despite my efforts to get her up and go for walks and get some fresh air. Even my husband, when he was alive, he was unable to get her out of bed. Investigator: some of your maids state that your daughter was healthy long ago, but her imprisonment has caused her health to deteriorate. Louise: she always had very delicate health, but it never stopped her doing her schoolwork. She loved the work that the school set for her to do, especially the reading. Investigator: by locking her away, you have deprived her of normal life, friends, and a social life. Louise: as a young girl, she rarely had any sort of social life. She preferred, above all, to visit churches. We all thought she had a vocation to become a nun. Investigator: you have also put pay to any chance of her marrying and having a family. Louise: she never discussed wanting to marry anyone with me. She never had any marriage plans. In fact, I'm convinced she never wanted to marry, nor had any interest in marriage. Investigator: what about Victor Camille? Louise: I don't know anyone by the name of Camille. My daughter never mentioned anyone by that name to me. Investigator: did you forbid the love and marriage between Blanche and Victor the lawyer? Louise: I have never heard of Blanche having a romantic interest in anyone. My daughter has never mentioned a lawyer to me, nor has she ever informed me of any marriage plan. Investigator: the hospital tells us that it is a miracle that Blanche is still alive given her condition upon arrival, but she is very ill. Louise: she has a pernicious fever that makes her very ill. Investigator: the hospital says she is very calm but won't speak to anyone. Has she been under the care of a doctor up till this point? Louise: it's been several years since a doctor has been to see her because she hasn't been ill for some time. Investigator: but the hospital informs us that she is so emaciated she should be dead. Louise: I gave her all the best food, but over time she ate less and less and grew thin. Investigator: why did you not attempt to determine the reason for your daughter's refusal to eat? Or to get your maids to clean the room and wash your daughter? Louise: I have been too sick myself, but ordered the maids to do it. If it didn't get done, it was because the maids didn't do it, or Blanche made it impossible for them to do so. If I have made a mistake, it wasn't with the intention of killing my daughter. I have always sacrificed myself for her. Investigator: did the fever you mentioned affect your daughter's mind in any way? Louise: no, she wasn't crazy at all, but she did have some odd ways of doing things. Investigator: the maids claimed that you wouldn't allow Blanche to wear any clothing. Louise: Blanche hated wearing clothing. Investigator: your maids also said you refused to allow them to change the rotting mattress. Louise: they are liars. They are two hussies. Everyone is free to do what they want in their own home. Since my daughter wanted to live that way, since she liked that way of life, and as she didn't want to see me, why would I have done anything contrary to upset her? In less than 2 days after her interrogation, Louise would be dead. Blanche was placed in a well-lit hospital room with big windows that overlooked the gardens and river, and understandably her eyes would not be adjusted to such bright light, so she often covered her face and asked for her dear little scarf. But by day 2 at the hospital, she only covered half her face and never once asked for the windows or shutters to be closed, and said things like, "Oh, how beautiful the dear little river is. Oh, look at the dear little swallows." Blanche refused food for the first 2 days, but then by day 3, she started eating everything that she was offered. At first, she was on a liquid diet, but then graduated to solid foods as she began to gain weight healthily. Her first solid food was strawberries. Staff said she clearly enjoyed eating them as she rubbed her stomach like a child eating a treat. A hospital intern said, "She always asks if the plates and cutlery are clean. She still eats with her fingers, but with great delicacy. When she eats an orange, she always keeps the pips in the palm of her hand until she is able to dispose of them." One particular nurse helped Blanche adopt habits of continence, and Blanche would ask for a chamber pot when she needed it and knew to wait until the nurse was able to bring her one. If there was an accident, Blanche was embarrassed and would regress to shouts of anger. Sometimes Blanche refused to say anything at all, or she would state a string of obscenities and insults of the crudest kind. Sometimes she would get angry and violent. But Sister St. Wilfrid said, "Blanche is always perfectly behaved, an angel of sweetness. Also, she has never tried to take off her nightdress, nor remove her bedclothes. What's more, she no longer uses the rude words that came out of her mouth when she was first brought to us." But when Blanche did speak, she used simplified French syntax. She never asked questions, but was able to answer questions simply and precisely, even though the responses were quite childlike and everything was a dear little. They did some comprehension testing on Blanche by first giving her an envelope containing a letter. Blanche was able to understand and vocalize that the letter was not addressed to her. Then, when another letter came, she was able to observe it was addressed to her. So she opened it and read the contents, which were from a relative asking how she was. Blanche became emotional and said, "My dear little world." She also did not like dark colors or darkness and would even avoid envelopes that were darker in color. Her eyesight, hearing, and other senses functioned perfectly well, as did her memory. She was able to identify flower names and even state where they originated, as well as the names of the local restaurants, where she went to school, her childhood memories at Les Pilets, trips she took when she was younger, and the name of some famous landmarks and monuments. She could even give the name of the priest who officiated her communion almost 4 decades earlier. As we already knew from the maid who brought her flowers in the attic, Blanche loved the scent of flowers and always held them in the hospital. She started to love applying perfume or cologne to her body and wear pretty dresses, then would admire herself in a mirror. She also no longer liked staying in bed and preferred sitting in an armchair looking out the window. In complete opposition to the Monnier family doctors, Blanche's doctors encouraged visitors because they believed it would help her regulate her moods. So it wasn't difficult for journalists and other interested parties to see her. As long as they spoke in a calming voice, Blanche was making great progress with her interaction with others. One Buenos Aires journalist printed his interview with Blanche on June 15, 1901. He observed someone in the hospital say to Blanche, "With well-shaped fingers like yours, you must be able to play the piano." And Blanche responded, "When I get married, I will play again. Yes, I will return to playing." She was so happy when someone brought her oranges or flower bouquets that she kissed them. Sometimes if she heard a voice that she did not recognize, she would panic, hide her face, and say, "Oh no, I'm not going back to my room." Another journalist asked her, "Would you like to see your mother?" And Blanche said, "Don't bring her here, don't bring her here," while gesticulating wildly and her face contorted with anger. But an offer of a strawberry calmed her down. When her years of imprisonment were seldom brought up, she said, "Let's not talk about that house. It forces everything to retreat, everything to retreat." The constant stream of people did begin to wear on Blanche, so a court order was placed so that only doctors and nurses were allowed in the room. But some reports indicate that the order was basically ignored and others were still allowed in when Blanche was doing well. So, of course, during her stay at the hospital, Blanche wasn't taking potassium bromide. There was no apparent way that the doctors and nurses would even know that Blanche had been taking it, let alone for decades. And even if they did have that information, there had not been studies on the long-term use of it at that point, so there's no reason to believe they would be suspicious of it right off the cuff. Thus, and I want to be clear about this, at no point was the cause of Blanche's destroyed nervous system attributed to the long-term effects of potassium bromide use. The connections simply didn't exist. And later, on June 19th, forensic doctors would officially decide that Blanche would never recover, stating, "From the mental point of view, we consider Mademoiselle Monnier to be an imbecile, minus habens, whose faculty for reasons is far lower than normal. She must therefore be classified as insane because she is unable to take care of herself and direct her own life." The day after Louise's interrogation on June 7th, her health quickly nosedives and she becomes semi-comatose. One nurse claimed that around 5 a.m. the following morning on the 8th, Louise spoke her last words, "Oh, my poor Blanche." Before 9:30 a.m., she entered a full coma, then died. The cause was heart congestion. When the news of Louise's death spread, one supportive neighbor named Abby de Clisson said, "She died like the holy woman that she was. She was a martyr. I believe the truth, not lies." And this made a lot of people angry in the community, and a mob pinned him against the prison walls as a threat. Because most people were either happy that this wicked woman was dead, or they were angry that she wasn't tried, so Blanche gets the justice she deserved. People sang the Commonality in the streets, which is a famous anonymous French Revolution grim song written specifically to mock and celebrate the downfall of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. It was a song you sang when someone you considered a tyrant was finally gone. Eugenie the maid laughed at the news of Louise's death, and Juliet said, "The evil woman died too soon. She should have gone to court and been tried." One of their soldier boyfriends said, "All that can be said of her is that instead of a heart, she had a Lourdes pebble." Lourdes is one of the most famous Catholic pilgrimage sites in France. People travel there seeking miracles and healing and bring back pebbles as token of their faith. The maid's boyfriend was saying that Louise was hard as stone, dressed up in the appearance of faith. Back at the hospital, it was time that the nurses told Blanche the truth about her mother, and that went a little something like this. "Nurse, I have some sad news to tell you, Mademoiselle Blanche. Your mother is dead." Blanche, "I want a party, I want a party!" Nurse, "Blanche, listen to me carefully. When you return home, you will no longer find your mother there." Blanche, "Pah, I just want to enjoy myself, Later, during an August 6th police interview, Blanche was asked, "Do you remember your father?" Blanche, "Oh yes." Police, "Is he dead?" Blanche, "I don't know anything about that." Police, "Do you remember your mother?" Blanche, "Enough talking." Police, "Would you like to see your mother?" Blanche, "No, it's best she stays where she is." Police, "Do you love your mother?" Blanche, "Yes, but it's better she stays where she is." Over and again, it became clear that Blanche had no regard for the death of her mother, and it held no significance to her. Monday, June 10th. It's 1 a.m. and Angele decides to have Louise's body carried from the inner courtyard of the prison under the discreet cover of darkness and away from public eyes. Louise's coffin sat in a glass hearse carriage as it drove from the prison to the chapel. But by 5 a.m., the press had got word and the chapel and cemetery were swarming with the public. Marcel could hear the service from his prison cell, but was not allowed into the chapel to be with his wife and daughter. Then, after the service, the hearse carried Louise to the cemetery. And during this 1 to 2 kilometer commute, or about 1 mile, onlooking crowds did not make the sign of the cross as they normally would have, and the men did not remove their hats in respect, and the sex workers along the way yelled unflattering remarks and insults about Louise. To preserve the integrity of the cemetery, the police gave orders to keep the cemetery closed while Louise was buried next to her husband Emile in the family plot. Now, 5 days after her death and 3 days after her funeral, the investigator searches Louise's bedroom on June 13th, 1901. In the corner of her bedroom sat a bulging wooden sea chest, the kind you'd picture in your mind when someone says the word treasure, all iron hinges and swollen timber. Eugenie had the key and unlocked it. Inside the chest were wads of banknotes and papers stacked in piles. When they counted it up, it came to 42,000 francs. But that wasn't all. Beneath it, bearer bonds and debt securities worth another 98,000 francs. They also found Louise's will dated January 5th, 1885. That means Blanche had been in that attic for 11 years when Louise last updated her will. Large sums went to some families of various names, Blanche's own godson even, and thousands more went to the Little Sisters of the Poor, which was a charitable office in Poitiers. And also she gave some money to the parish priests to distribute among the poor. She was literally giving all her money to charity and to Marie Fézy's family, basically. She also left 15,000 francs to the hospices of Poitiers to maintain the family plot at the cemetery. Her grave and her husband's Emile grave, her parents' graves, and when the time came, Blanche would be buried there too. No mention of Marcel, though. And then her next words are telling. No other plots, graves, or vaults were to be established on that land, ever. She tasked the hospices and her executor to enforce it personally, making sure Marcel couldn't wriggle his way in, and by extension, not his wife or daughter either. Ouch. And Blanche? Louise spoke directly about Blanche in her will, writing, "To my daughter I bequeath, by precipitate and full part, an usufruct and enjoyment of 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of my house, in addition to the one she already occupied. I want my daughter to continue to remain after my death in the part of the house whose usufruct I have just bequeathed to her. She will receive the care of the woman Fézy, to whom she is accustomed, and in addition the company of 1 or 2 nuns of Bon Secours, whose convent is in Blois. I decree that all my daughter's income, as well as all that she will collect after my death, is devoted exclusively to the care she needs. As my daughter is unable to personally direct either her own person or her own property, I appoint to her as guardian and administrator Monsieur Paul Dieu and some other lawyers as he's unavailable, who will be also responsible for the full and complete execution of all my provisions and while I appoint my executor. I ask that if the gentleman is willing to take on the arduous and delicate mission that I entrust to his loyalty, that he accept the sum of 5,000 francs that I bequeath to him as recognition and as a very low remuneration for all the pain that will give him the functions of executor of this will." Obviously, Louise never updated her will after Marie Fézy died. And also notice, no nursing home, no hospital, no alternative. Every penny Blanche inherited was those 2 little attic rooms. Locked away from her own hands, Louise was making sure that no matter what happened after she was gone, Blanche was never, ever leaving. When a copy of the will made headlines, people were shocked. Everyone assumed Marcel was Louise's co-conspirator and that he'd be rewarded, that Blanche wouldn't see a single franc. They were half right. Blanche got nothing she could use, but Marcel got nothing either. Louise had played her final hand and cut them both out. It was the most honest thing she'd ever done, because for the first time, everyone could see her clearly. Does this will change how you see Marcel? Is he a coward who did nothing, an active participant, or someone who tried to push back and paid the price for it? In our final chapter, part 5, Louise, of course, is dead, which means she never faced a courtroom, and because of it, Blanche never got the justice she deserved. This also means the only person left to face the judge was Marcel. And what happened next is either the most infuriating thing in this entire story, or the most predictable thing, depending on how you see it. Because Marcel did stand trial, and he did face a verdict. And the twist that comes after that verdict is read will make your blood boil. But part 5 isn't just about the trial. It's about Blanche, where she ended up, who she became, and the one quiet fact that says everything. She outlived every single person who hurt her, and that feels like the only justice this story ever got. Part 5 is where we finally find out what that cost her, and what she did with the time she had left. À la prochaine. See you next time.